everyone, welcome to the next video in the series on surviving a borderline parent, how to heal your childhood wounds and build trust, boundaries, and self-esteem. I'm a licensed clinical psychologist who also grew up with parents who struggle with borderline, and I truly believe that understanding how your parents struggled often holds the keys to understanding how you struggle and hopefully some ways moving forward to heal. So one of the things you have to do, I think this is relatively true, and it's not like I just worked on that in therapy and I was done. There's this ongoing reality of grieving the childhood that you always wished you'd had. And even when you grow up and you try to set up your life in a different way, you're not in the trauma anymore, ideally, there can be a deep and profound sense of grief you will hold inside about, and I've heard this with so many patients, and I've thought this myself, like, I wonder who I would have been if I hadn't had this particular set of struggles. And I think this is true for anybody, regardless of what your childhood trauma stories are. But there's often a grief in the parts of ourselves that we've had to let go of and lose, a grief in the parts of ourselves we may never be able to fully access or know because they're so guarded or so wounded or so hurt. And so this chapter talks about growing up. You may have suspected that something was wrong, that your family seemed different or unhealthy, but you may not have known specifically what the cause was. And so that is often the case, especially with having parents with borderline, is that, as I've talked about, we don't even necessarily know how deep the well of grief is or how bad things were because A, they weren't always bad, and B, that was our normal. So I want to read this to you. It says, the need to grieve. Adult children may grieve for a lost childhood, since they may have assumed the role of a miniature adult and parent to their parent. Remember, parentification and enmeshment are extremely common in untreated parents with borderline. Parentified children raised by their parents to be the caretakers have to grow up quickly, seemingly bypassing the years when children are playful, free, and curious. As adults, they may feel old, tired, and have few memories of their childhood. That can be for many reasons, but that is common for us. Adult children may also grieve over the realization that they may not have been loved for who they were. Instead, love was conditional, based on looks, intelligence, behavior, or a parent's whim, or I would say on giving the parent what they needed from you emotionally at the core. And I'm going to read this to you from Alice Miller's book, The Gifted Child. It is one of the turning points in therapy when the patient comes to the emotional insight that all the love she has captured with so much effort and self-denial was not meant for her as she really was, that the admiration for her beauty and achievements was aimed at this beauty and these achievements and not at the child herself. In therapy, the small and lonely child that is hidden behind her achievements wakes up and asks, what would have happened if I had appeared before you, sad, needy, angry, and furious? Where would your love have been then? And I was all these things as well. Does that mean that it was not really me that you loved, but only what I pretended to be? The well-behaved, reliable, empathic, understanding, and convenient child and adult, before I understood this, who in fact was never a child at all. What became of my childhood? Have I not been cheated out of it? I can never return to it. I can never make up for it. And then one more part real quickly, it says, and someone mentioned this, another follower the other day, adult children may grieve too for the loss of their own false self, the mask they learn to wear to secure a parent's love. After a while, the mask becomes nearly indistinguishable, even to the child who is wearing it. And the thought of removing it to reveal the real self underneath can be overwhelming. Who am I if I'm not my father's or mother's little girl? Who am I if I'm sad, needy, angry, or furious? So we often idealize the parents we never had. We have to come to terms with that. And they talk about in the book these stages of grief, which are obviously Elizabeth Kubler-Ross's stages of grief: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. And obviously we know that those grief stages can go back and forth. They don't just flow in a little perfect line. But you have to come to terms with the version of the parent that you had, the idealized version you created, the parent that you told yourself they were. I mean, there's so many layers of that. And so if we don't deal with our grief, we often can bury our feelings and they can pop up in symptomatology. We can try to find someone else. We're always trying to find someone else to heal that grief. And so we can't stand being alone in the pain. We can do the opposite and just isolate alone in our grief and spend years alone, not safe with trusting anyone, or thinking that eventually it'll just go away. And the truth is that it often doesn't. And so there are some journal exercises here, which I do have a couple of these in my courses, and I think my longer course on healing from these kind of parents. But one of them is to write a letter to your parent that you will never send. Really important. And what you do is you write a letter. You can write from your child self. You can write to them. And you want to talk about what you experienced, what you needed and wanted, what you wished you'd had. You know, you can talk about trying to create acceptance if you want to. You can try to identify the wounds, like whatever it is. It's just like saying all the things that you still need to say or never got to say. The other option is to write a eulogy for your parents' funeral without regard for trying to write it from the perspective of like how they'd like it to be written. You can do these writing exercises really from the child self, from the adult self, from the harsh self, from the angry self. Like part of the grief processing is anger, and we're going to get to that. And then I would suggest that you do some kind of ceremony where you rip it up, you burn it, you throw the paper away. Like there's some kind of releasing process. You burn a candle, if you're someone who's religious, maybe you say a prayer. You know, there's a lot of debate about whether or not you need forgiveness. And as I've said, I think that there is a great deal of research that talks about different forms of forgiveness that don't necessarily mean you're saying it's okay what happened to you. That's where I think the nuance gets often lost. But at the core, however you want to frame it, one of the great difficulties, but most important parts of this, however you get there, and I actually don't believe you have to be forgiving, but you have to come to a place where you set free that parent inside you. You surrender, you let it go, not let it go like it didn't happen, but you try to release the grip it has on your heart. Because if you stay in the, look what you did to me, look at the person I could have become, like that needs to happen. There's a process, and that might take years, it might take months, it might take a day. You have to work through that. But if you live in that, you can never be free. And at the end of this, I'm going to do one more video, and I'm going to really kind of just summarize the rest of the book, because I really couldn't begin to touch the amount of content in this book. But what I want to say to you is that if you don't understand that one of the things that having the awareness and the final acceptance, literally after finishing a master's degree in psychology and a doctorate in psychology, giving my mom the label of understanding that I fully believe my mom was borderline and is, and I fully believe because of my father's extreme trauma, among other issues he had, that he very well may have had some form of borderline complex PTSD. It feels more like narcissistic borderline and trauma and extreme depression, as I've shared. He decided to not be here anymore when I was 23, and he was not my biological father, which I found out later in life at 42, thanks to my mom with borderline, who never thought to tell me that. As someone who has spent her entire life alone with no family and no real connections, and the ones that I did have family, I didn't know because I didn't grow up near them and they lived super far away. The point is, I almost went on a rampage there, a rant, and I might come back to that. But what I want to say is that giving her the understanding that she did have this disorder, and it actually did come from reading the book, Understanding the Borderline Mother. I know I talk so fast. Understanding the Borderline Mother by Christine Lawson. It set me free. And this is why I want you to know, if you have this disorder, this is why it's so important for you to make space for us to talk about it. If we were raised by parents who were untreated and undiagnosed with borderline specifically. Because on the one hand, it made me understand her and it took it less off of me. And on the other hand, it just explained things I could never find an explanation for. Like, if you love me so much, and you say that you do, then why do you do these things to me? Why do you hurt me so much? And so giving her the label, whatever you want to call this disorder, it made it easier. And she does not have, as I've said in so many videos, some big trauma history that I can be like, oh, well, I have compassion for. My best friend has a mom like that. And it's different because even though it's still painful, it's like, oh, this was a terrible childhood. And that doesn't take away the pain from you, even if they had a terrible childhood. Because a lot of the things that have hurt me the most were things that felt intentionally cruel. That's the part I am the most hurt by. I'm not as hurt by the parentification. I'm not as hurt by the enmeshment. I am hurt by the cruelty and the rage and the anger of both of my parents. That they could not, whatever you want to say, control or chose not to or justified or minimized or whatever. And that's the important part, that the work I've had to do also on grieving who I could have been and all of that. If you don't find a way to get out of that through understanding labels and working on your healing, you end up being stuck in the role of, I don't like this word victim, because I actually do think that when people say, oh, I'm not a victim, like I do think I'm a victim of those things. I just don't want to be defined by those, and I don't want the fact that these things happen to me to hold me back. But I also want to hold compassion and grace that I did have this childhood. And so it makes some things in life harder for me. That if you didn't have, just like all of us, we have certain parts of our childhood that really can hurt us. And what hurts me might not hurt you. But whatever it is, it does affect us. It's not fair to put two horses in the same race. One that has a broken leg and has healed, and one that never had a broken leg. They'll never be the same. So, I am ranting, I know, but I really want to share with you how important it is to really understand that you are worthy of understanding your grief. And it is incredibly important to do in terms of your healing and understanding and whatever ways that plays out for you. So, thank you for being here. I know we got a little off a tangent there, but I have some more content coming up I'm super excited about. So I'm trying to finish up this series because I really think it's important, but I also want to get to some new stuff I want to share with you. And I am just so grateful you're here. And I hope that I can continue to show, up in a way that you find helpful. And I really appreciate how you showed up for me even the other day. So thank you so, so much. And I will see you tomorrow. Stay safe and take care. Okay.